What they conveniently omit, however, is the inconvenient truth that even this so-called good inflation fundamentally means your hard-earned savings are slowly, but inexorably, melting away in the background. It may not be the hyperinflationary chaos of Weimar Germany, but it is unequivocally still erosion, still a hidden tax. The only real difference, ultimately, is the speed at which your wealth is being diminished. So, in light of this persistent historical reality, how exactly does one protect oneself from this silent assault on wealth? History, unequivocally, offers potent lessons. In ancient Rome, the true survivors were not those clutching debased, copper-laden coins, but rather those who shrewdly hoarded real silver and gold. In Weimar Germany, those who possessed foreign currency or tangible land were able to weather the storm relatively intact, whilst those who had diligently saved in marks were utterly wiped out. In the turbulent 1970s, individuals who held hard assets, real estate, commodities, precious metals, successfully preserved their wealth as cash holdings rapidly burned away. More recently, in Lebanon, those with dollars securely held abroad managed to survive the collapse, while depositors whose funds were trapped within the domestic banking system lost virtually everything. The pattern, therefore, is always chillingly consistent. Inflation relentlessly punishes the trusting, the passive, and the diligent savers. Conversely, it generously rewards the prepared, the liquid, and those astute individuals who hold tangible assets. And yet, despite the devastating historical record, governments will undoubtedly continue to employ this stealth tax. Why? Because the direct alternative, openly raising explicit taxes, is almost always politically suicidal. No politician, after all, wishes to look voters squarely in the eye and declare, "We are unequivocally taking more of your paycheck." But as the age-old adage reminds us, there is no such thing as a free lunch. By 2021 and 2022, inflation roared back with a vengeance. Energy bills shockingly doubled. Food prices surged dramatically. Housing costs spiked to unprecedented levels. Once again, the unequivocal winners were those who held substantial assets. The undeniable losers were the struggling middle class and the already vulnerable poor. Inflation, in this context, became the tax that nobody ever voted for, yet virtually everyone was compelled to pay. This devastating pattern, it must be stressed, is a global phenomenon, repeating itself across continents and cultures. In Argentina, decades of chronic overspending and relentless money printing have tragically transformed inflation into a bitter way of life. Families frantically rush to spend their pesos before the currency loses even more of its dwindling value, and entire generations are growing up with a deeply ingrained distrust of their own national money. In Zimbabwe, during the 2000s, hyperinflation captured global headlines. Trillion-dollar banknotes that couldn't even buy a loaf of bread, national savings utterly wiped out, and an entire nation reduced to the primitive system of barter. More recently, in Lebanon, between 2019 and 2021, commercial banks froze withdrawals while the national currency collapsed by a staggering 90%. Doctors, engineers, retirees, the very backbone of the middle class, watched in helpless horror as a lifetime of diligent savings simply vanished within months. Different places, different leaders, different eras, but always the same cunning trick. Sometimes, even certain economists attempt to dress up this insidious phenomenon as good inflation. They'll confidently tell you that a steady 2% inflation rate is healthy, arguing that it encourages spending and keeps economies suitably dynamic. Yet, they also deeply fear it, because when this hidden tax grows too large and too conspicuous, the public inevitably notices and becomes restless. This inherent tension is precisely why they constantly endeavor to downplay its true impact, to massage the official statistics, and to subtly alter the calculation formulas. Ask yourself, when your grocery bill has noticeably doubled over a single decade, yet official inflation is consistently reported at a seemingly benign 2% a year, who, ultimately, benefits from that discrepancy, from that carefully constructed narrative? Perhaps the most revealing modern example unfolded in 2008. When the global financial system teetered on the brink of collapse, governments around the world responded by bailing out banks through the creation and printing of trillions of new units of currency. They termed this unprecedented intervention quantitative easing. For Wall Street, it was nothing short of salvation. For ordinary savers, however, it felt like an undeniable act of theft. Asset prices, stocks, real estate, luxury goods soared dramatically, while the wages of everyday workers largely stagnated. Crucially, inflation didn't immediately manifest in consumer goods. Instead, it aggressively showed up in asset markets. Houses doubled, then tripled in value. Stock markets exploded upwards. Predictably, the wealth gap widened substantially. The hidden tax had simply changed its guise, but it was still the same age-old trick. Devalue the money supply, punish diligent savers, and disproportionately reward borrowers and the financial elites. Then came 2020. When the devastating global pandemic struck, governments worldwide responded by printing money on an even grander, more audacious scale. Stimulus checks, massive bailouts, and corporate rescue packages were all funded by digital money conjured out of thin air. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt like magic. Free money appeared. Debts were temporarily suspended. In real terms, you are effectively losing 4% of your wealth every single year. Crucially, that lost value doesn't simply vanish into thin air. Instead, it is subtly transferred. It shifts to borrowers, whose debts shrink in real terms, to governments, whose formidable deficits become considerably easier to finance, and to asset holders, whose real estate, stocks, and commodities continually climb in price, all while your patiently saved cash quietly withers away. This, ultimately, is a grand redistribution scheme, cunningly masquerading as benign economics, a systemic method of moving wealth from the many ordinary people who hold money to the discerning few who hold tangible assets. The 1970s, in particular, made this hidden tax painfully visible for millions. In America, inflation surged into terrifying double digits. Families watched in despair as the value of their cherished savings melted away before their very eyes. Mortgage rates soared to unprecedented levels, making homeownership an increasingly distant dream. Workers were compelled to demand ever-increasing wage hikes simply to keep pace with the relentless rise in the cost of living. The hidden tax became so glaringly obvious that then Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker was forced to inflict a brutal, deliberate recession by aggressively raising interest rates to nearly 20% in a desperate attempt to crush inflation. It worked, certainly, but at an immense and heartbreaking human cost. Countless businesses closed their doors, and millions of people tragically lost their jobs. In many respects, the medicine proved to be far worse than the disease itself. And yet, the deeper, enduring lesson from that era remained clear. Inflation, in the final analysis, is always paid for by ordinary, working people. Governments, paradoxically, harbor a complex relationship with inflation. They love it because it serves as an incredibly effective stealth weapon, a silent means of taxation. The British Empire, for instance, understood this intricate game exceptionally well. During both world wars, Britain managed to finance colossal military campaigns, not solely through conventional taxation and borrowing, but significantly through controlled inflation. The Bank of England would discreetly print more money, prices would subtly creep upwards, and ordinary citizens would quietly and unknowingly shoulder the immense cost of war. After these monumental conflicts, while politicians grandly celebrated victory, diligent household savers were left to discover that their precious pounds now bought far less than they had before. Inflation, in these contexts, can truly be described as a form of patriotic theft, cunningly disguised as a necessary shared sacrifice. The entire 20th century, in fact, is replete with similar stories. In the United States, for example, inflation quietly and efficiently eroded vast amounts of public debt in the aftermath of World War II. Politicians enthusiastically lauded this as economic growth. Yet much of this so-called recovery was simply the silent shrinking of colossal wartime obligations achieved through steadily rising prices. Then, a pivotal moment arrived in 1971 when President Richard Nixon unilaterally severed the dollar's direct link to gold, effectively cutting the last remaining anchor of monetary restraint. From that fateful day forward, governments were granted what amounted to an unlimited license to inflate their currencies. Fiat currency, money backed by nothing more than government decree, rapidly became the global standard, and inflation, once a consequence, increasingly became the quiet, insidious normal. Now, let's bring this closer to home and consider your own financial life. Imagine you deposit your hard-earned money into a bank account, diligently earning a modest 1% interest. Yet, simultaneously, official inflation is running at a persistent 5%. By the devastating year of 1923, the situation had deteriorated to such an extent that workers were often paid twice a day, purely because their wages were losing value by the hour. Housewives would literally race to market to buy food items before prices had doubled by evening. Children famously played with stacks of worthless banknotes, building them up like bricks. A simple loaf of bread could cost billions of marks. In essence, a lifetime of diligent savings was utterly obliterated. The insidious, hidden tax had escalated beyond recognition, transforming into an outright confiscation of national wealth. But here lies an even darker truth, a profoundly cynical observation. Governments worldwide observed these catastrophic disasters, not concluding that inflation was inherently dangerous, but rather recognizing its immense power. For inflation is, without doubt, the most politically convenient tax in existence. When governments choose to borrow, spend, and print money on a grand scale, they possess the uncanny ability to repay their old debts with currency that has been significantly devalued. This hidden tax effectively erodes their financial obligations, often to the detriment of creditors and, crucially, everyday savers. The state, however, survives and often thrives. Moreover, ordinary people rarely march in protest against the abstract concept of inflation in the same way they would against explicit, visible tax increases. This is primarily because the theft feels so diffuse, so confusing, and so incredibly difficult to pinpoint or attribute directly. You see, you don't receive an explicit inflation bill in the mail that tells you how much you owe. Instead, you simply notice that your rent is inexplicably higher, your weekly groceries cost significantly more, and your hard-earned salary simply doesn't stretch as far as it once did. Make no mistake, this is often entirely by design. They'd keep the familiar, reassuring face of Caesar prominently stamped on the front, maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed. Initially, the populace remained largely oblivious. But inevitably, over time, the coins grew perceptibly lighter, thinner, and contained significantly more copper than silver. Predictably, prices soared uncontrollably, public trust in the currency evaporated, and the once robust economy eventually reverted to a system of barter and reliance on pure gold. The empire's money had been systematically debased, a hidden tax levied upon every citizen, imposed without a single formal decree. Rome itself may have eventually crumbled, but this ingenious, destructive trick, sadly, endured. Fast forward now to revolutionary France in the 1790s. The nascent government, facing dire financial straits and desperate for funds, resorted to printing vast quantities of paper notes, known as assignats. These were supposedly backed by the substantial wealth of confiscated church lands. Initially, they appeared to be a promising financial innovation. However, as the state continued to print more and more, the intrinsic value of these notes plummeted catastrophically. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Bread riots erupted across Paris. Farmers staunchly refused to accept the devalued paper currency, and countless ordinary families watched in horror as their life savings simply evaporated. The government, technically, hadn't raised taxes. It had simply inflated the money supply, effectively and quietly stealing wealth from every citizen who held paper assignats. And then, of course, we arrive at Weimar Germany, an example that remains the most infamous and stark inflationary collapse in all of history. Following the devastation of World War I, crushed under the immense weight of reparations and crippling national debt, the Reichsbank embarked on a relentless and seemingly endless campaign of printing money. You are, in fact, being taxed every single day, often without even realizing it. Not through the familiar deductions of income tax or the visible burden of sales tax, but by something far more insidious and invisible. It won't appear as a line item on your pay slip, nor will any politician openly acknowledge its existence. Yet, Insidiously, it quietly drains your hard-earned savings, diminishes the purchasing power of your paycheck, and surreptitiously steals a piece of your future. This, my friends, is the hidden tax of inflation, arguably the oldest trick in the book that governments have employed for millennia. Inflation truly is the silent thief of wealth. It relentlessly erodes the value of your savings, gradually shrinking the real worth of your paycheck, and systematically transfers economic value from ordinary citizens to governments and the astute elites who understand how to navigate and profit from this intricate financial game. Indeed, it stands as arguably the most convenient form of taxation ever conceived, precisely because it bypasses the need for your explicit consent. And here lies the brutal, often unspoken truth. Inflation is rarely an accidental occurrence. Rather, it is often a calculated choice, a deliberate tool, providing a discreet yet powerful means for governments to fund their ambitions without enduring the political backlash and public outcry associated with openly raising taxes. Consider the historical precedent of ancient Rome. The mighty Roman Empire proudly paid its revered legions with silver denarii coins, a currency universally trusted across the vast Mediterranean world. However, perpetual wars were ruinously expensive. Astute emperors soon stumbled upon a cunning solution. Instead of the politically perilous act of raising direct taxes, they could simply reduce the silver content within their coins, subtly mixing in cheaper base metals. It is simply far easier to allow inflation to perform this unpleasant task silently, invisibly. They will tell you inflation is merely temporary. They will insist it is firmly under control. They will redefine how it's measured, subtly altering the goalposts. They will invent sophisticated-sounding new terms, quantitative easing, modern monetary theory, all designed to make it sound highly technical and macroeconomic, rather than deeply personal and detrimental to your finances. But in the end, the fundamental reality remains unchanged. Inflation is, unequivocally, a tax. It is the oldest, one of the most effective, and arguably the most inherently unfair tax in the entire annals of human history. So, the next time you observe prices inexplicably rising and politicians offer a dismissive shrug, remember this crucial insight. It is not an unforeseen accident. It is not some complex, unfathomable mystery. It is, more often than not, a deliberate policy choice, and it is invariably you who ultimately pays the price. If this perspective has offered you a new understanding, then perhaps consider subscribing. The answers to these enduring economic puzzles are not hidden away in some distant future. Rather, they are clearly written for all to see in the lessons of the past.